Morning, Nigel. Instead of talking about immigration where the prospects are horrific, I thought perhaps we might discuss the financial aspects belonging to the EU. And I don't think it's properly highlighted. I mean, we've got to start from the premise that this country is, frankly, irretrievably bust. And I'd just like to start by setting out the deficits that listeners understand. We've got two deficits to worry about. One is the budget, and one is the accumulated debt. Unless we make a surplus on the budget, we can't reduce the accumulated debt. So obviously, if we defer reducing that, the debt gets bigger and bigger. But when we look at what we can economise on, cutting down the police, libraries, all that sort of thing, we should be looking at our contribution to the EU. Because I don't know what we're going to pay in this year, 19 billion, of which 11 billion is surplus, and the 11 billion is going towards countries, and I've got nothing but admiration for Poland, for instance, towards building wonderful roads and town centres and that sort of thing, which, frankly, is dead money.
Yeah, no, I remember when Tony Blair was president in office of the European Council back at the end of 2005, in a speech to him, I said, why should British taxpayers subsidise a new underground system in Warsaw when, frankly, the London Underground, is sort of rather third world in itself. Jeff, the big point you make, I have to say, if you asked me what was my biggest frustration from the general election, it was the leaders' debates, where I was on with Cameron and the others, and when Dave said, we've been prudent, we're in control, the nation's finances are safe with us. And then we went to Ed and everybody else who said, oh, no, we must spend more. And I said, what planet are we all on? Does nobody realise that this government that claims to be prudent, far from being, vicious, cutting, nasty, they've doubled the national debt in the space of 5 years. And still, Jeff, no one has really got a handle on this. Our annual deficit is still running at about 80 billion sterling a year. Our accumulated national debt is now about 1.5 trillion. I agree with you. I mean, look, we give £25 million a day away in foreign aid, £55 million a day away in EU membership fees. We could, by cutting back on those drastically, make a big saving and dig a big hole into the 80 billion. But I'm not going to sit here, even as UKIP leader, and pretend to you that everything can be solved by not giving money to Brussels.
How did you react, Mr Farage, this week at a dinner in Malta? The Prime Minister spent the thick end of £500 million, 275 million to Turkey, 150 to Eritrea. I mean, this is money that your voters, my listeners, give through their taxes. The Prime Minister seems to just get the chequebook as he sees.
Well, I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? He said that his proudest achievement as Prime Minister was that we now gave more money in foreign aid than any other country in the Western world. He's even put an Act of Parliament in place to make sure that we continue to give 0.7% of our budget every single year. And this 275 million, that isn't part of the £1 billion a month we already get.
Part of the...
No, this is extra.
This isn't different.
Yes, but, Mr Juncker asks him to do it, he just says yes. Well, it's not his money anyway, I suppose, is it?
More on Mr Cameron later in the end, because I want to get your view on his press conference. Well, go ahead, Nigel Farage.
Of course. So anyway, Jeff, the point you make is a very valid point. At some point, at some time in the next 5 years, there will be a proper debate in this country about our level of indebtedness. I've tried like crazy to get it on the agenda. I've failed. But, Jeff, you do your best to wake people up, please. And thank you for the call. Moving on to Ranjit in Birmingham. Good morning.
Good morning, Nigel. Recent figures released by the ONS showed that 80% of jobs created in the last year went to EU citizens. Only 87,000 went to British people. 327,000 went to EU citizens. And that percentage has basically been increasing slowly over the last 10 years.
Yes, I mean, look, Ranjit...
Why do you think that is?
We keep, firstly, we keep being told of the wonderful economic benefits of immigration into Britain. And there's no doubt that the people who benefit the most are the immigrants themselves, coming from poor countries, getting better paid jobs, and they benefit. The question is, does the country benefit? And in many cases, a lot of foreign workers who earn money send that money back to their home countries, which of course means it's not going through the high streets and the pubs and wherever it may have gone. But it also, of course, it's led to, a downward drive, a decompression of people's people's wages over the course of the last 10 years. And I don't believe that all of this is a benefit. The one thing I would say, just to sort of balance this a little bit, is there is clearly a problem, Ranjit, in this country with British people who are on benefit going to work where they may find themselves actually worse off than being, and the overnight news we've had is that for Mr. Cameron to stop migrant benefits, he's actually going to have to stop benefits, in-work benefits for young British people.
Yes, just explain what that means, because this is his attempt to deal with EU arrivals, but actually it's going to hit Brits too.
Yeah, the only way, look, we had Mr. Cameron's big renegotiation letter this week. Pretty piddling, frankly, in terms of what it wanted. He wanted 3 assurances from Brussels, but there was one thing to be renegotiated, and that was the ability of the British state not to pay in-work migrant benefits to people for the first 4 years of being here. Do you know what? It was in the UKIP manifesto. He knows how popular on its own that policy would be.
That's about the only one that was saber-rattling of the 4, though, wasn't it?
Yes.
They won't argue with the other 3.
No. The other 3.
It's motherhood and apple pie.
They will jot down a letter to him over lunch, and he'll come back, and they'll reopen Croydon Airport, and he'll say, "We've got this wonderful promise from yes." Anyway, so the only way we can stop migrant benefits, in-work benefits, for up to 4 years is by correspondingly stopping them for British people. And so what that will mean is they will bring in a 4-year qualifying rule, which will mean a British worker won't qualify for in-work benefits until they're 22 years old. And actually, there are lots of people out there who are 21 years old, living together with children in work, who as a result of this will be better off not being in work. It is absolutely mad. Ranjit, I do understand in some cases why employers like to have Eastern European workers, because there is an argument they work jolly hard. But I also think that we are doing down our own young people. I think they're now being discriminated against in the workplace in many cases, and we have a social security trap, which looks like it's about to get worse. What's your view, Ranjit?
Well, I agree with you. I think the British people are hard. Over the years, over the decades, it's consistently been shown that British people are the hardest working people in Europe, and that goes for youngsters as well. I think this is all that's happening here. There's a huge democratic deficit here, isn't there, Nigel? Because the British people vote for a government, they go for 5 years of austerity, thinking that things will get better for them, chances of jobs will increase, and then they find that actually their chance of getting a job after all that effort, all those tax credits, they're getting poorer and poorer, people at the bottom end getting poorer and poorer, and then they find that they have a much lower chance of getting a job now. 87,000 jobs in a year, or about 200,000 jobs over 2 years after all that austerity for British people. Imagine what the odds of a British person getting a job are now. It's ridiculous, all that happening.
Well, I think
EU citizens are inviting their friends over, which I would do as well if I was in this
look, let's not. You're right, actually, with the tone of that. Let's not blame the EU workers. They're just trying to better their lives. Let's blame the British government for not giving our own people a better chance in life.
If you were a building contractor, Mr. Farage, and you had to get some lads or girls on a building site hulking bricks around, would you go for Brits? Would you go for Poles? Would you go for Eastern Europeans? Who would you go for?
Well, of course, now you've asked me a question here where I could get myself in terrible trouble. So if I was to say to you that I would like to discriminate, gosh, that's a bit of an awful word, isn't it, in favour of British people, I might find myself in terrible trouble under it. You can't do that sort of thing. After all, we're all Europeans now, aren't we? Look, what we do know, Nick, is a lot of big companies want cheap migrant labour because they want to drive down their costs. And one of the arguments that you'll hear from Lord Rose and Mandelson and whoever else is on the stay in the EU side, one of the arguments you'll hear is there is an economic benefit to the country as a whole by keeping wages low. I don't actually believe that to be true. But you know something? Even if it was, so what? There are some things that are more important than GDP figures and growth figures and money, and that is about the state, the cohesion and the happiness of our society as a whole. And that, I think, has been the biggest price of open-door immigration to limitless cheap migrant labour over the last decade.
Earlier this week, the Prime Minister told us, Mr Farage, we're moving into the formal part of the renegotiation. he made it sound almost like a NASA countdown. Here we go, 10, 9. What did he mean?
Well, what he meant was that the so-called informal part, which in theory has been going on for the last 6 months, has got almost nowhere. He did, by the way, attempt something slightly more formal in October at a meeting of the heads of government where he was going to put his ideas on the table for the first time. But they were so consumed by the migrant crisis that he only got to speak at the dinner at 1:05 in the morning. And he spoke for a total of 7 minutes. And halfway through it, President Hollande from France got up and went out for a pee. So that's how seriously they've been taking the British renegotiation. This is absolutely true, folks. That's how seriously they've been taking it. Now, what he really means by formal is there is a big heads of government meeting on December the 17th in Brussels. That at the moment is titled to be where 28 leaders, plus the European Commission and the European Council, sit there and talk about the British renegotiation. But if we've already surrendered on benefits for UK workers to compensate not giving benefits to Polish or Lithuanian workers, then that doesn't need to be renegotiated. In fact, nothing needs to be renegotiated. All he gets is a promissory note. I have a feeling that the migrant crisis, which is now overwhelming Europe politically, even Sweden, the most open-minded,
border controls,
have put border controls.
Fences in Slovenia, isn't it? Razor wire going up in Slovenia.
Absolutely. Well, my analogy for this is that Juncker signalled everyone come, and then Mrs. Merkel in the summer, what she effectively did was to take out the cork from a bottle of champagne and say, "Aren't we marvellous?" And now they realise that it's actually completely unsustainable. And they're trying to get the cork back into the champagne bottle. Listeners, try and get a cork back into a champagne bottle. It actually can't be done. So they've got desperate problems. My view...
I thought you were a beer man, Mr. Farage.
Well, I didn't say necessarily that I was part of the Champagne Islington set, did
checking.
I? No, I do like a pint. You're quite right. A bit early at 9:15. But no, and I think if I was the Prime Minister, I would think to myself, the no side appear to be a bit divided. The migrant crisis next summer can only get worse. I'm going to go for this referendum as soon as I possibly can.
When?
Well, I think it'll happen in the first 6 months of next year.
Do you have some intelligence on that?
No, absolutely none. No.
Just your gut.
No, I'm not. Please, not saying all rush down to the bookies. But I just have a feeling that the Prime Minister has nothing to gain.
And is the No campaign ready for a vote that early in the new year?
Well, there is a slight problem with the Leave campaign, and it's perfectly clear what I'm going to do and what UKIP's going to do, and we're the one party united in terms of where we stand on this issue. There's no high-ranking figure in UKIP saying we should remain. That's pretty clear. Most Labour MPs will say stay, some will say leave. Quite a lot of Tory MPs may say leave. The majority, though, will say remain. The problem is that there has to be an official designated group for both the yes side and the no side. And there are two competing groups on the no side at the moment. And I think what we have to do on my side of this debate is we have to get these two different groups together. I think we need to be absolutely united on this.
And lastly, before we go to the next call, had Britain voted last night on this, which way do you think the vote would have gone? Well,
it's very interesting. There is actually an opinion poll in today's Daily Mail. It's a piece by Andrew Pearce, and it's the first opinion poll showing the Leave side in the lead by a lead of 6 points. And that was on the back of Cameron's renegotiation, not impressing anybody. I think, what I really think is today, looking at this benefits idea that's been put forward, I now begin to think that a lot more people on the left and the centre-left of British politics, who believe in looking after people and the benefit system, realising that actually we're not allowed to have our own benefit system if we're members of the European Union, because increasingly they're dictating to us how benefits work. And I think that when we see opinion polls next week, I suspect that the Leave side will be even further ahead.
We move on, Mr Farage. Where are we going?
We do. We go to Dennis in Manor Park. Good morning.
Good morning. What do you think about this tax credit? I just heard a young lady on the phone to Nick, and when she explained that she earns £32,000 a year, he was ready to jump down her throat in this figure of speech and saying, well, what, you can have this, and you've got mobile, have you got that? When she explained to him that she pays for childcare, and you only get childcare on a certain conditions. If you earn X amount of money, you can't get the childcare. And then he said, well, I realise that now.
Let me stay on the line. I just want to fill Mr. Farage in with the details. This was a caller called Anne, who's paid 35,000. She actually clears 2,100. Her mortgage is £800 per annum. Her childcare for a 2-year-old is £1,100 per annum. That's what allows her to make the 35, and suddenly she's got £200 a week. Now that brought home the reality. Yeah. Where do you stand on the proposed cuts?
The people that have suffered worst in Britain over the course of the last decade are those on low and medium salaries who've seen their costs of living in all directions go up and their incomes be depressed by the factors that we talked about earlier on in this programme. I mean, look, if the government wants to shift the burden from tax credits to increased salaries with an increased minimum wage / living wage, that's fine by me. But it's the way they phased it in that is so cynical that means good people who are working will be worse off. And I support, Nick, the Frank Field idea.
Yes.
Frank Field, who I think is one of the most independently minded members of Parliament. He happens to be Labour, but that's not even relevant. And he said, if you're going to do this, make sure that one is phased simultaneously with the other. And I support that, Dennis. And I think that to effectively be seen to attack those that are working hard and struggling to make ends meet is absolutely crazy.
Quick response from you, Dennis, before we move on.
Thanks for that. I appreciate that. I just wanted to know that how much, if you was more in power, what would you do? Would you go against this?
Well, what I would do, Dennis, is I would stop the uncontrolled migrant flow of labour coming in from Europe to help sort of market forces, to help get wages up a little bit. But I certainly would not want to kick those at the lower paid end of the scale and the medium paid end of the scale. That would be wrong. It's wrong with tax credits, and it looks like, from what we're being told overnight, that as a means of dealing with EU migrant benefits, we're further going to kick young British workers. So I think we're getting this wrong.
We move on.
We do. We go up to Cumbria to speak to Trevor.
Hello, Mr. Farage.
Good morning.
I'd like to you to expand on Paul Nuttall's comment last night on the NHS. He said that your policy is to privatise.
No, he didn't.
Yes, he did.
No, he didn't. Go on.
Yes, he did.
Oh, no, he didn't. It's nearly Christmas, isn't it? Pantomime season.
I'm sorry, I watched the programme. He said, when somebody said to him, do you believe in privatisation? He said, oh, yes.
No, what he's...
So, you know...
OK, all right. OK, fine. Right, there are two things to say here. Number one is he did comment that it was a Labour government that was privatising it. And indeed, let's just get our facts straight here. The people that did effectively privatise the National Health Service or begin that process were the Blair government during those years. And they privatised a much bigger chunk of the National Health Service than the last coalition government. They're the facts. What Nuttall did say last night was this, that in many areas, through their procurement procedures for drugs, the National Health Service, on the advice of NICE, was actually paying very much top dollar for a lot of drugs. And he felt that maybe we should sort of cut the bureaucrats out of this and get a businessman in charge to try and get us better value for money by buying our drugs on the free market. I think procurement is a very different thing, Trevor, to privatising aspects of the National Health Service. I hope that's clear.
Quick response from you, Trevor.
Okay, well, that's fair enough. But what is your policy? Do you believe the National Health should stay as it is, then?
Do you know, we believe in the National Health Service and not the International Health Service. That's what we believe in. And once again, I was pilloried for this during the general election, and I'm sorry. But it's there to treat British people. It is not there to treat Uncle Tom Cobley and all from across the world. Health tourism alone is costing the National Health Service about £2 billion. But the NHS, Trevor, and we haven't got time for it now, the NHS has a major, major problem. And that is the population of this country keeps going through the roof. And we frankly haven't got the facilities to deal with a population expanding as quickly as it is.
And to those who say we wouldn't have an NHS without the people who've come to this country to be our doctors, our nurses, our clinicians and everything else, how would
I would say shame on us for not training more nurses and doctors and not making sure that people who have been trained actually have to give a few years back in this country before being allowed to go abroad. And I would also say if people want to come here on work permits and work as doctors or nurses, that's great. But actually, my point is, what is the National Health Service for? We've lost sight of it, in my opinion.
While we're on the health service, quick one here. Email from Benjamin in Amt Hill, which, as I recall, I think is in Bedfordshire. Does Nigel Farage support the junior doctors in their strike action?
No.
Why not, Mr.
No,
Farage?
I don't. I think that they are behaving in an extremely militant way. The fact is that doctors... we've talked this morning about all the groups in society over the last 10 years who've had a bad deal. Doctors, over the last 15 years, fully qualified doctors, have had one of the best deals. They literally had Gordon Brown over a barrel. A lot of them now are paid a lot of money.
Junior doctors?
Junior doctors do have to work hard. Of course they do.
Some of them making 26 when they start out.
Yeah, and some of them making quite a lot more. And I don't think this is straightforward at all. I think there are examples of junior doctors who are paid quite poorly. There are other examples of junior doctors being paid quite well. I don't think, given generally how well paid a qualified doctor is once they've been through those few years, I don't think there's going to be much public sympathy with the strike.
They say patient safety will be put at risk by Jeremy Hunt's actions. They're going to be tired. They're going to be exhausted. They're going to be making possible wrong decisions.
But then you'll always hear that argument, won't you, from somebody in the health service who is looking for a better deal. I don't at the moment feel a huge wave of sympathy for the idea that our junior doctors, who are en route to being some of the best paid people in society, are threatening a strike. I don't like the look of it. All right. And we go on to Sade in Shoreditch. Good morning.
Hello, good
Hi.
morning, Nigel. Hi. What do you think about schools interfering in sending letters home to parents saying that their children may be overweight?
These are the so-called fat letters sent to the parents of children who are overweight and are not helping combat and obesity and should be stopped. Mr. Farage, this came from the Royal Society for Public Health earlier this week. They say parents don't find the information useful and only half knew even why their children were being weighed.
Well, I mean, now let's just get this right. If the parent isn't aware that their son or daughter is overweight, I suggest that a letter isn't going to make much difference anyway, is it? Look, I don't know. I do believe Sade in education on this, and I have to say, I am far from being a health freak myself, but there's a particular can of ginger beer that I buy. And when I'm going fishing or travelling, I normally have a can of it in the car, and I enjoy drinking it. And I was genuinely shocked when I found out that brand had the equivalent of 12 teaspoonfuls of sugar in that one can of ginger beer, and I'm buying a little bit less of it. That's an example how education, can make people do things better. I just have another feeling about this, Sade, when you talk about schools. I would love to be criticised for this and told I'm wrong, but from what I can see, a lot of schools do not encourage competitive team sport in the way that perhaps they should. And one thing that's for certain is if youngsters in their teens are playing sports and team sports keenly, they won't be overweight. They'll be far too busy out there training. And I wonder whether we shouldn't be doing more sport in schools.
My turn for a question, if I can. I'd like to refer you to the front page of the Times, Mr. Farage. Europe is in a race against time to save its system of open borders. One of its most senior figures warned yesterday after an EU summit to curb mass migrations ended in spectacular failure. Donald Tusk, the president of the European Council, warned more countries would like to follow Sweden, which you've already mentioned, in reimposing border control. Yeah,
look, if you can't control the external border and there are vast numbers of people flooding in, then countries are putting up barriers against each other. It started with Viktor Orban, the premier of Hungary. He was condemned for building a fence, but actually now other countries are following. The fact is, this Valletta summit that's just taken place this week, the object was to put in place some rules to repatriate African migrants who did not qualify as refugees. They finished the summit by saying they would put in place a voluntary system. So therefore, the message that is still out there to Africa and everywhere else is if you come to Europe, you'll be allowed to stay. And I think that the two great achievements of the European project were the euro and the Schengen area. Thank goodness we opted out of both of those. But both of those now look to me to be under complete and total threat.
And how appropriate was it that the Prime Minister left that conference and handed over to the Prime Minister of Holland, the Netherlands, to take our role?
I mean, Prime Ministers, as we all do in life, have priorities, and he felt coming back to meet Mr. Modi was an important thing to do, which actually, do you know what? It was. But to appoint in our place to represent us, me, you, the listeners, the Dutch Prime Minister, who is an EU fanatic and thinks Britain should stay in the EU at all costs, seems to me to represent the biggest surrender of sovereignty ever. Not only now are we a minority on the European Council, we're now allowing foreign countries to represent us.
Is Donald Tusk the sort of man you could do business with or want to have a pint in a pub with? What sort of bloke is he, Mr. Farage?
Mr. Tusk, I do find...
Is it Tusk? I do apologise.
Tusk, I think it is.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think he likes me very much. He criticised Poles that left his country for higher salaries elsewhere and then resigned as Prime Minister and became President of the European Council, multiplying his salary fivefold. I did point this out to him once, and we're not exactly great mates. Having said that, the head of the European Commission, Mr. Juncker, with whom I disagree, politically, enormously, but I find rather engaging and rather charming. It's a funny thing. People often assume who are outside politics that if you disagree on policy, you absolutely must hate each other. And yet, to be in a green room chatting to Ken Clarke, as long as we don't discuss Europe, I find him quite charming. So it's a funny old game.
Time for one more, I think, if we're swift.
More.
Yes.
Yeah. Carl in Plaistow. Good morning, Carl.
Plaistow is pronounced.
Plaistow.
Monsieur Farage. Good morning, Senor Farage as well.
Hello. So, got to be a quick one. We've got about a minute, Carl. What's your question for Nigel Farage?
Monsieur Farage says to the point that the European Union was formed in the wake of 2 world wars fought on European soil. We have now had peace in Europe except for non-union members. We have now had peace in Europe for 70 years because of the Union.
No.
Does Mr. Farage wish to return to the separatism of the first half of the 20th century with the resulting conflict?
No, Carl. After the First World War and the Second World War, we saw the League of Nations formed, we saw the United Nations formed, we saw NATO formed, which I suspect in the case of Europe is rather more important. The European Union hasn't kept the peace for 70 years. It was only actually invented in 1992 and called the European Union. The idea that it's kept the peace is to presuppose that Germany would have rearmed and gone to smash France to bits again. I don't believe Germany has had any appetite since 1945 for militarism or expansionism of any kind at all. And Carl, now what you're seeing by countries being forced together inside a free movement zone and inside a currency that doesn't work, far from a Europe of peace, love and harmony, is a Europe where the South now resents the North and vice versa, and where political parties on the extremes of right and left are now on the march. It's not a Europe of peace, it's a failure. The way, Carl, to have peace in Europe is to have democratic, sovereign nation states trading together and being mates together, and that's the Europe that I want.
You've been listening to Phone Farage.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.